Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to this school come workshop on data analysis in cosmology and astroparticle physics. The speaker of today's morning session is Professor Tirthankar Raijuri. He has been already here discussing perturbation theory. And from today onwards, he will be giving 4 lectures on 21 centimeter cosmology. So over to you, Tirthada. I mean, the standard rules are still there. I mean, people will keep themselves muted, and whenever they have some questions, they will unmute themselves and ask the questions or type in the chat box. Okay, so the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Supratik. So let me share the presentation. I hope all of you can see this. So today my plan is to start our discussions on what I call the epoch of reionization. And you will soon see what this is and why this is important and why are we planning to study it in so much details. So let's just go along. I mean, let's just start to describe the epoch of reionization in the context of the history of our universe. So what has been shown here is you can think of this as a timeline of our universe. So the time is flowing this way. Universe is expanding as well as it's cooling, as you know. So Big Bang, I mean, the beginning of the universe will be somewhere here. Present day will be somewhere here. And then various things are happening, and that's something we want to describe. The first epoch, which is of interest to us, is what we call the last scattering epoch or the last scattering surface. This is the epoch at which the universe becomes neutral for the first time. In other words, the first atoms in the universe form. This is also known as the recombination epoch. And this is also the epoch from which the cosmic microwave background radiation originates and kind of free streams to us. You have heard about CMB in other lectures, I'm sure. So this is the first epoch which is of interest, and this is of interest because this is the first time, let's say, hydrogen atoms form in the universe. Before this, everything was ionized, predominantly ionized. Now, let's go a bit forward in time. After this recombination epoch, we enter an age which is kind of popularly called the Dark Ages. This is called Dark Ages because there were no galaxies in the universe, galaxies, stars. I mean, there was nothing which was kind of radiating. There was CMB, of course, but there was no like brightly shining objects in the universe. This is called the Dark Ages. What was happening was, if you remember my earlier lecture, during the CMB, during the last scattering epoch, we know that the universe had already developed small inhomogeneities. In temperature, those were 1 part in 10 to the 5. Now, these inhomogeneities were growing because of gravitational instability, which also we learned in the previous lecture. So they were growing, but they haven't grown to an extent that the collapsed halos have started forming and galaxies have started forming or the stars have started forming. So structure is forming, but it's still very dark. So that is the region of Dark Ages. If you think about redshifts, the last scattering epoch, or when the first hydrogen atoms formed, the redshift was typically of the order of 1100, 1100. That's the kind of redshifts one is talking about. These Dark Ages would have just started after that and would continue somewhere up to redshift 20 or so. Okay, we don't know the exact redshift of when the Dark Ages ended, but if you want to keep some number in mind, you can think of 20, 25, something around that. Then comes the next. So after darkness comes the dawn. So there will be a cosmic dawn. This is when the first stars in the universe form. Now the structures have evolved sufficiently, and hence there are galaxies forming within the dark matter halos. And these galaxies will have stars. So there is light in the universe. And as I said, when did the first stars form? We still don't know. But if you have to keep a number in mind, anywhere between 20 to 25 is something you can keep. Of course, as more and more observations come, these numbers may get revised in the future. Then comes the epoch of reionization. Now, from the name reionization, you know things are going to get ionized again. Things became neutral during the last scattering epoch. That is when the first atoms formed. Before that, anyway, the universe was completely ionized. Now, the moment you form the first stars, the radiation from these stars will come out and will eventually start ionizing the hydrogen atoms in the universe. And as more and more hydrogen atoms get ionized, the universe starts to get more and more ionized. So this process is called the epoch. This process is called reionization, and the corresponding epoch is called the epoch of reionization. So reionization is that epoch when hydrogen in the universe gets ionized by the stars, the light from the stars. Of course, the reionization will start after the first stars form. So reionization starts somewhere after redshifts of 20, and we think it ended somewhere around redshift 6, between 5 to 6, let's say. And then we entered an era which is known as post-reionization. So that is the era we live in. In the post-reionization era, bulk of the universe is ionized. Okay, so this is something you should keep in mind. We live in a universe which is predominantly ionized in cosmic scales. Whatever neutral gas you see, neutral hydrogen or helium or whatever you see, are mostly within the galaxies, okay, inside the galaxies, where things can kind of shield themselves from radiation and remain neutral. But outside the galaxies, where bulk of the matter is, this diffuse medium between the galaxies known as the intergalactic medium, that is predominantly ionized. So we are living in an ionized universe. So that is something. Okay. Now, this epoch is very important because it's often known as the final frontier of observational cosmology. Why is that? Let us look at the same timeline, but in a different way. Okay, so now the time is flowing this way. And I've given some interesting times and you know the corresponding redshifts. So this is the time, 4 into 400,000 years, when the CMB originated, and we see the small fluctuations. Okay. Then they grow because of gravitational instability, and we see our large-scale structure around us. And this large-scale structure is studied via galaxy surveys. So again, if you remember the kind of things we were doing in the previous lecture, I told you about CMB inhomogeneities and also galaxy surveys. Okay, so these are the two major probes of large-scale structure. Now, galaxy surveys actually probe the universe. Again, in cosmic terms, it probes the universe which is more local, more recent, closer to us. So, for example, it's probably probing the universe between when its age is between a billion years to of the order of 10 billion years, the current age. Now we have observational probes of the universe during CMB. We have observational probes later, but there is a region which is still to be observationally probed. There is a cosmic era which is still not probed observationally. So I have kind of indicated that by the shaded region. And it is in this era the first stars and the galaxies form and the universe gets reionized. So that is why people are trying to study, I mean, observationally as well as theoretically, the epoch of reionization, so that the story gets completed. Okay, so it's like you have the first few pages of the book and the last few pages of the book, and there's this middle pages which are missing. Okay. So we would like to find what those pages contain. And so that our just to make sure our understanding is correct, whatever we thought about structure formation, and what are the details, because there are many details which might be missing. So those details can be filled in. So that is why the epoch of reionization is very important, and that is why we are studying it. And it's kind of the next frontier of cosmology. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, the first galaxy, suppose you want to study observationally, you can do it in many ways. One way is to go and try to detect these galaxies using telescopes, okay, optical near infrared telescopes. So you will see the light coming from the galaxies. Okay, the stars are shining and you will see the light. So these will be done. These will be done by the James Webb Space Telescope, which is going to go up. It's a satellite which will go up very soon. So it's like you can think of it as a like upgraded version of Hubble Space Telescope, though there are differences between the two. And then there will be extremely large telescopes on the ground as well. So those will also get built in the next decade or so, 5 to 10 years. They are being built. The planning and the construction have started. So these will also be able to actually detect. I mean, among the many science goals they have, one is to detect the first stars in the universe directly. Now, the one thing you should keep in mind is this kind of direct detections are always biased towards brighter galaxies. Brighter galaxies are easier to detect always. So you will always be so you will detect something, but you won't know whether those galaxies are representative of the population there. It's like looking at the number of people somewhere, and you are preferentially, for example, seeing the tall people. And then if you try to draw some conclusions based on only those people about the full population, then you will draw wrong conclusions. Okay, so if you think about calculating the average height of people, you will calculate them to be much higher than the representative population, and so on. So there could be various such examples. So that is a problem of doing it directly. Okay, so you have to actually wait till you make sure you have detected enough galaxies and different kind of galaxies, and also the faint ones which are difficult to detect. So there are always possibilities of complementary studies, okay, studies which are not biased in this way. Okay, is there a question by someone? Sorry. Okay, so yeah, so that alternative study is to study the effect of these galaxies on the, let's say, the hydrogen in the universe. Okay, and that is hydrogen reionization. So what one can do is one can go and study hydrogen reionization. So there you are trying to study hydrogen in the universe. So you're not detecting the galaxies directly, but you know the hydrogen is affected by the galaxies, okay, because the reionization happens because of galaxies. So by looking at the hydrogen, you are indirectly trying to understand when these galaxies formed and what kind of galaxies they might be, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that is the idea. So you can do either direct detection or you can do something indirect which has to do with reionization. So this is another movie. So the left-hand movie is something slice I showed you in the previous class, that is showing structure formation. So as universe evolves, this cosmic wave forms, and along these filaments you will see these galaxies forming, halos and galaxies forming. The right hand slice shows you, for the same slice, the evolution of neutral hydrogen in the universe. So initially the neutral hydrogen simply traces the underlying density field. But then as you form more galaxies, you will see hydrogen is getting ionized. So that is denoted by this black region. So if you look carefully, you will see the moment the halos start forming, there are these small black regions forming, and then they are growing, and then they grow, And then they start to overlap, different regions start to overlap, they percolate. And then at the end, the full universe becomes like predominantly black, that is completely ionized. What you should also realize is if you compare these two things very carefully, you will see regions where the galaxies form first are the regions which get ionized first, obviously, right? And regions which are far away from galaxies, like voids, get ionized later. Again, obvious, but the point I'm trying to make is these structure of these ionized regions, these black regions in the universe, know about the galaxies which ionize the hydrogen. So this is the way one plans to study the galaxies without directly detecting them. So this is the basic idea you should try to understand. So that is where what relates the galaxies to reionization. Now, there are many things we would like to learn about reionization, and that will help us in studying the galaxies. For example, this epoch, like when did it happen? When did the sources produce enough photons to ionize the universe? I mean, was it at redshift 10? Was it at redshift 6? We now have the answers, but initially people wanted to know these numbers, and that's how the field evolved. Then the nature of reionization. I mean, was it a slow process? Like it started very early, then slowly the universe got ionized over a long time? Or was it a very sudden process that suddenly it started ionizing and within no time everything got ionized? Okay. Was it a very homogeneous process or was it very patchy? Okay, that different regions ionized at very different times and so on. And then what are the sources responsible? I've been constantly talking about stars, but are we sure that the universe was reionized by stars? Okay. Can they be like other kind of cosmic objects like quasars, or maybe some exotic particles did the job, or maybe a combination of these things? So these are the kind of questions one is trying to ask and answer and model and then compare with observations and so on and so forth. And you can add more questions to these, but I think these are the most important questions one is trying to study. Now, again, I mean, since we are not going to spend a lot of time like developing the theory and so on, what I will do is I can only give you overview. So a quick overview of reionization is what we know today is this, that we have a lot of evidences for reionization, and the most like direct evidences come from what is called Lyman alpha forest and CMB. CMB you all know, and I will quickly tell about Lyman alpha forest in one slide. Okay, but what they tell is that Lyman alpha forest data tells us that the universe gets ionized by redshift 5.5. Okay, typical numbers. CMB data tells us something complementary. It says that the reionization must have started earlier. The midpoint would be somewhere around redshift 7 to 8, let us say. So that already tells you that reionization is a reasonably extended process. Okay, so the midpoint is somewhere around 7 to 8, finishes at 5.5. So maybe it starts around 10 or something, so that everything is well explained and so on. Okay. And as of now, the most promising candidate for reionization source is stars within galaxies. Okay, so we don't have any evidences which tell us that we need anything more exotic. Okay, it has to be stars which did the job. How these things are built and these things come up, I unfortunately won't have time to discuss here. But over the years, evidences have built up, models have been developed, and so on. And this is what we know currently about reionization. Of course, I mean, from the theoretical aspect, there is a challenge. The challenge is to build a model of reionization that matches all the data sets simultaneously. For example, there is Lyman alpha forest, CMB, there are other data sets as well. And you build a model and you have to make sure that everything falls in place. Okay, it should not be that your model is very good in matching one set of observations, but completely fails in doing something else. Okay, the other set of observations. That's not very good. Okay. So that is something one should keep in mind. That a model building in reionization is not very straightforward. Okay, you can make simple models, but you have to be very careful while interpreting them. This is one slide on Lyman alpha forest. So what is shown here in this plot is what we call quasar absorption spectra or quasar spectrum. So what one does is quasars are very bright sources. Okay, so these bright sources arise because of the central black hole within galaxies, a very powerful black hole, and it radiates because it's accreting matter from nearby. The advantage of quasars is that they are so powerful and bright that they can be observed at till very, very large distances. Okay, so very high redshifts. So what you do is you observe the quasar light as a function of wavelength. So x-axis is wavelength, y-axis is the amount of light you receive, okay, in some arbitrary units to start with. If you observe a nearby quasar, you will see that its spectrum looks something like this. Okay, there is a sharp peak. Okay, it happens around 1215 angstrom. It's a Lyman alpha wavelength. And then otherwise it's reasonably featureless. Okay, you can kind of fit it by a power law, roughly. Now, if you go to slightly higher redshifts of 3 or so, what you will see is the same peak appears. So this is a different quasar at higher redshift. The same peak appears here, but blueward of it, that is at lower wavelengths, you see a lot of absorption happening. Okay. This absorption is happening not because of anything inside the quasar. It's happening because of the intervening neutral hydrogen between the quasar and us. So the light is coming from quasar to us, from redshift 3 to us, and that light is getting absorbed by neutral hydrogen, and the absorption is happening because of Lyman alpha transition. Lyman alpha transition is nothing but the electron which is in ground state absorbing a photon and going to the n equal to 2, the first excited state. So this is how you do. So this region is known as the Lyman alpha forest. Lyman alpha because it is arising from Lyman alpha absorption. Forest because of the way it looks like. Okay, a series of absorption happening. So the reason Lyman alpha forest is so important because it is tracing the neutral hydrogen distribution between the quasar and us. You need to understand that Lyman alpha transition won't happen if the hydrogen gets ionized, right? Because then there is no bound electron. So clearly it is telling you information about the neutral hydrogen. And in fact, these observations tell us that, for example, at redshift 3, the universe is very highly ionized. Okay, you can calculate the amount of neutral hydrogen present and you will be able to show that this is pointing towards ionized universe. So that is why we know that we are living in a very ionized universe. Reionization did happen. Now, I mean, we have observed 100,000s, like observed a million quasars at different redshift, different directions, and all show the same feature. Okay. And then if you go to slightly higher redshifts, come to closer to redshift 6, then you see something weird happening. If you look at the last spectrum, for example, you see the same peak. But here, where you expect this nice forest, you see it's quite like flat and quite dark. Okay, there is almost no red intensity here. So maybe this is an indication that maybe the nature of the universe is changing as we come to closer to redshift 6 or so. The interpretation is slightly more complicated, but yeah, I mean. Now we know that these spectra are indicating that the reionization is probably ending somewhere nearby. Okay, but for that you have to do a bit careful modeling and calculation. It's not an easy job to interpret these observations. So that is Lyman alpha forest. As I said, evidence from reionization comes from Lyman alpha forest. Evidence for reionization also comes from CMB. Now CMB, the origin of CMB is because the universe is okay. Somebody asked why is the peak shifting. So that is basically redshift. Okay. So in these two plots, the redshift is not shown. I mean, they had scaled the wavelength to account for the redshift. But in this case, it's just the effect of redshift and nothing else. As you go to higher and higher redshift, it's shifting to a higher and higher wavelengths. That's all. So the probing reionization using CMB. So CMB, as you know, originated when the universe got neutral and the photons were not getting scattered of free electrons anymore, and then they just free stream to us. That's the physics of CMB. Now, as the photons free stream to us, when you again ionize the universe, the photons can now start scattering of electrons again, and that will leave signatures in the CMB, and that is how people probe reionization using CMB. Now, there are many effects on CMB. For example, it produces a polarization signal at large angular scales, that is at low values of L. And the E mode polarization is something which has been detected from reionization. It damps the anisotropies at all angular scales. Okay. And so there is a degeneracy between the damping of anisotropies because of reionization and the amplitude of the power spectrum. So you have to break the degeneracy. You can either break through polarization signal or you can also break it through lensing. Okay. But the essential quantity which is derived from reionization is the optical depth of Thomson scattering of photons, CMB photons of free electrons. Okay. So this optical depth is calculated like this. It is a integral over basically number of free electrons in the universe. Okay, it's a line integral. Okay, so it's along the line of sight. So that is how it is done. And the free electrons is basically provided by reionization. If there was no reionization, suppose hypothetically, then this tau would be 0. Okay. And the earlier the reionization, you have more contribution to this integral. So higher the value of tau. The later the reionization, the lower is the value of tau. As I said, the current constants on tau imply that the typical redshift of reionization is somewhere 7.5 to 8, 7 to 8. It depends a bit on the modeling, but this is the typical numbers. So remember, these are only telling you about when the reionization was somewhere in the mid stages. Okay. Whereas the Lyman alpha forest was telling you when the reionization ended. So these two observations bring complementary information. Okay. So you should not confuse these two completely. Okay. Some people get worried that, oh, CMB observations is telling that reionization is 7.5. Lyman alpha observations are telling that reionization is 5.5. So there is tension in data, crisis in cosmology, and so on. No, nothing like that. Okay. So these are all just lack of understanding of the data. The thing you should also realize is this tau, since this affects the CMB, when you are doing cosmological parameter estimation, this tau will affect the constraints on other cosmological parameters because of various degeneracies. So that is why people believe that getting the tau right is very important. Otherwise, what may happen is you may get the values of some other cosmological parameters wrong. Okay, or it may not be very well constrained. This could be the amplitude of the primordial power spectrum. I think maybe you have learned them. AS it is called, or the slope of the primordial power spectrum, the scalar perturbations, which is called the NS or something equivalent, and so on. So that is why getting the tau correct and understanding reionization is so very important. In fact, the constants on tau also has a nice history. So what has been shown here are the constants on tau by this red line for different experiments, different CMB experiments. Okay. So if you look at it, initially, first of all, you will see the error bars were large, and as time progressed, the error bars got less. But there's something more interesting. You will see the value earlier, people used to think that the value of tau is much larger than what we think now is. These were during the WMAP days. WMAP was a satellite, a CMB satellite, which went up in early 2000. I mean, the data came at mid 2000 and so on. And those days, WMAP gave a value of tau which is higher. Tau high means the reionization happened earlier. So many people, including us, thought that the reionization happened much earlier. And that had many consequences. But later, when Planck went up, and they did a much more careful job of dealing with the systematics and foregrounds, they showed that the value of tau is actually much smaller than what was thought earlier. So now we think that the reionization happened much later than what we used to think earlier. So you see our conclusions change as the data improves and then more and more observations come. And this is something which will tell you that why doing observations carefully is so very important. And you have to then also try to interpret those observations theoretically. And so it's a very coupled system, observations and theory. And one has to do both of them like very carefully. Now, this is a broad overview of reionization. For the rest of the class, what I plan to do is to tell you the physics of reionization. So what are the things you need to know and understand if you want to understand reionization and, let's say, model reionization? So let us first tell you the steps, okay? Various ingredients you need to understand the physics of reionization. Sorry, just give me a second. Yeah, sorry about that. So the first ingredient you need are the dark matter halos. Okay, this, if you remember my earlier lecture, I mean, this dark matter halos can be understood from perturbation theory, or you have to do from simulations. And these dark matter halos are important because these are like stable structures in the universe, and that this is where the galaxies will eventually form. Okay, so forming and understanding the dark matter halos is very important. Then within the dark matter halos, you have this gas, and this gas has to go through various processes like cooling and fragmentation and various things, which will lead to galaxy formation and star formation. Okay, so dark matter halos are dark matter halos. I mean, if you are only at dark matter halos, there won't be any galaxies. So you have to do a bit more gas physics in order to understand the galaxy formation. Then you have to also understand, now galaxy has formed, stars have formed. You need to also understand the spectra of these stars. Okay, so how many photons do these stars produce? Okay. So that is very crucial, because without that you won't know that how many ionizing photons have come out from the stars. So stellar spectra is an important part of the study. Okay. Then comes a very important part of this physics, which is the escape of photons. Imagine you have a dark matter halo galaxy inside that, and that galaxy has produced stars, and stars have produced ionizing photons. But the galaxy itself has neutral hydrogen. So maybe many of the photons are basically absorbed within the galaxy. Okay. And they don't come out of the galaxy. Now, in the extreme case where all the photons are absorbed inside the galaxy by the neutral hydrogen, then there is no reionization of the universe by stars, because the photons are all inside the galaxies and the bulk of the matter outside the galaxy, I mean, they just remain as they are. They don't even know that stars have formed because no photons have come out. At least no ionizing photons have come out. Okay. So clearly that doesn't happen. Photons do come out, but not all photons come out. Okay, some photons are absorbed inside the galaxy. So this is called escape of photons from the galaxy. And this also needs to be understood carefully. Okay, because if you now say that all photons escape, what you will do is you will ionize the universe too quickly. Okay, and vice versa. So you have to really figure out a way so that the appropriate number of photons do escape from the galaxy. Then the photons have escaped, and then they see the bulk, the universe, this cosmic web, okay, all the hydrogen atoms sitting there. So what you have to do is you have to now make sure how the radiation propagates through this intergalactic medium. So that is known as propagation of ionization fronts. This is usually done through what is known as radiative transfer. Okay, so how does the radiation go through the intergalactic medium? Now that will determine how fast the universe get ionized and which regions get ionized first. Okay. So for example, it is clear that the medium very close to the galaxy will get ionized first, and then the fronts will slowly move towards the voids, the regions which are far away from galaxy. Broadly speaking, this is the ingredient of reionization physics, and these ingredients I can broadly divide into three boxes. Okay, dark matter part, which if you think about my earlier lecture, we have covered this. And then there is a galaxy part. Okay, what is happening inside the dark matter halo and inside the galaxy. And then there is the radiative transfer part, what is happening to the photons when they come out of the galaxy. Okay, so these are three boxes, but these three boxes are constantly talking to each other. Okay, it's not like you can understand one box without understanding the other. And then they are crosstalk also. Okay, it's not like you can understand them in a linear order, that first I understand this, then I will understand that, and that, then this. There is this coupling between these subjects. So it's a very, again, complicated and non-linear problem, not very easy to do. And what is not often appreciated is after you do all this modeling, you have to then calculate the observables. Okay, because you need to compare with observations, right? Without that, what will you do? You will make a model, but then you don't even know whether the model makes sense. And then finally, you have to do statistics. Okay, because you will make observables, but comparing with observations require handle on statistics. Okay, so if you cannot just look at plots and say, oh, this is a very good match with that. That is good starting point, but eventually when you want to do science, you have to make sure that your statistics is solid. Okay, so you should be able to answer questions like, given the observations, what is the probability that my model is correct? Okay, is it 99% or 99.3%, or is it less than 60%, and so on. Okay, so it's very important to understand these concepts. Now, let me spend some time on some details of this physics. So I again will avoid any mathematical details, but everything I'm going to say is backed by like proper mathematics, calculations, and so on, except those mathematics may not be easy to do on pen and paper. You have to actually do numerical calculations, but there is a sound theoretical kind of backing to whatever I'm trying to say now. Now, think about these dark matter halos and the gas, because gas is the most interesting part, which will form stars. Right? The dark matter halos are not going to, the dark matter is not going to form stars and radiate. Now, dark matter halo we discussed in the previous lecture is in virial equilibrium. Okay, so the gravitational collapse is balanced by random motions of dark matter particles. Now the gas basically follows the dark matter because dark matter is the bulk gravitating component. And basically, since it can attract very efficiently, so the gas will just go and sit inside the dark matter halo. But what will happen is, as it is attracted to the dark matter halo, or what we call, if it's falling in the potential well of the dark matter halo, it acquires kinetic energy. Okay, so just like if something is falling towards the earth, it will, like as it comes closer, it will acquire more and more kinetic energy. So similarly, of course, this is happening at a much random level. So the gas will acquire kinetic energy, and that kinetic energy will get converted into a temperature. Okay, so if there is kinetic energy, we know that we can describe the average properties of that system by a temperature, and the temperature will be very high. So it's called that the gas is shock heated to a temperature, and the temperature to the order of magnitude will be given by the potential. Okay, because the kinetic energy and the potential energy are related. So you will realize that kT will be gmm by R of that order. Okay. Now, if you think about, for example, a 10 to the 8 solar mass halo at redshift 9, that will acquire a temperature of 10 to the 4, and you can work out what will be the temperature for other kind of halos. What is the corresponding density? The corresponding density you will see will be what? Few hundred times the average density. Why? Because we saw that the typical over density or density contrast of the matter inside a virialized object is what we said, 18 pi square. Okay, so just if you are doing order of magnitude calculation, approximate 18 pi square by 200. So it's 200 times the background density, right? And 200 times the background density will give you a density which is something like 10 to the minus 25 grams per cc. This is just too small a density for nuclear reactions to start. If the gas was like this, at this temperature, at this density, we won't see any nuclear reactions. So somehow you have to condense the gas, in the sense you have to make the gas of high density. To do that, the only way you can do is to decrease the pressure, and hence you have to decrease the temperature. So you have to cool the gas. Unless you cool the gas, what will happen is there will be a halo. Inside that, the gas will be shock heated to a temperature of 10 to the 4 K and low density, and it will remain like that. It will forever remain like that. So one has to find a way to cool it. So nature has found a way to cool it. It cools via what is known as radiative cooling. Okay. So basically what happens is there are atoms which are colliding with each other. And once they collide, once in a while, it will transfer energy, and that energy transfer will excite the atom from ground state to a higher excited state. So imagine all hydrogen atoms to be in the ground state. Two atoms collide. There is an energy transfer. So let us say one of the atoms, the hydrogen, the electron goes from ground state to a higher excited state. Okay. But it won't stay in the higher excited state. It will come down. Okay. This is basically, you can think of this as spontaneous emission. Okay, from a higher excited state, it comes down, and typically the time scale of this thing happening is 10 to the minus 8 seconds or something like that. It will happen very quickly. Now, when it comes down, it will emit a photon of corresponding energy, right? That's spontaneous emission. If these photons now escape out from the gas, from the galaxy, what you will realize is that photon will take away some energy from the system. So effectively, the total energy of the system will go down, and the energy, the system will start cooling. This is called radiative cooling. Okay, radiation is taking out energy from the system. And this is basically happening because of collisional excitation. Okay. So this excitation requires the gas to have temperatures larger than 10 to the 4 K. So unless you are able to collisionally excite initially, there won't be such cooling. Okay. So as a result, what happens is halos which are very small, their initial temperatures are lower than 10 to the 4 K. So there is not enough energy to do this excitation. So if the initial excitation doesn't happen, the resultant cooling will also not happen. Okay. So it may seem a bit counterintuitive. It seems hotter galaxies can cool, or hotter gas can cool more efficiently. Cooler gas will just remain there and won't cool any further. Okay. So this is something you should understand. As a result, high mass halos can cool better than small mass halos. So in small mass halos, it becomes very difficult to form stars. Okay. So in small mass halos, what happens is the gas just remains heated to a temperature which is less than 10 to the 4 K, but high enough so that there is no star formation happening. Okay. So this is the physics of cooling. Now this can get a bit more complicated. The example I gave was because of through hydrogen, but if there are other metals and so on, their presence can change the cooling rate. And similarly, presence of molecules can also change the cooling rate. Okay, so those are details. This, for example, shows the cooling rate as a function of temperature. And you can see that the cooling rate, look at the red one. The red one is for a typical halo having hydrogen. And you will see that this curve falls rapidly at 10 to the 4 K. What it is telling you is you cannot cool the gas if the temperature to start with was below 10 to the 4 K. So cooler gas cannot cool. Hotter gas has very high cooling rate. Okay, 10 to the 5 K, 10 to the 6 K gas has reasonably high cooling rate. They can cool very efficiently. So that is something you should keep in mind. And the physics is something which I just told in the previous lecture. So this involves understanding of quantum mechanics as well as statistical physics, okay, thermodynamics. So it's a coupling of these two which play a role. You will realize that doing astrophysics actually requires expertise of all branches of physics at the same time. So you cannot say that I will only learn electricity, magnetism, and classical mechanics, or whatever I like, and I do astrophysics. It will be very difficult. Okay. So doing astrophysics means you need to learn all branches of physics, because you are going to study systems, and systems don't care about how we divided the physics disciplines. Okay. Systems will have everything happening there. So depending on how much details and what aspect you are studying, you may need anything in physics, starting from electricity, magnetism, radiation, to statistical physics, thermodynamics, to quantum mechanics, to classical mechanics, relativity, whatever you could think of. And now, of course, you need on top of that mathematics and statistics and numerical coding. Okay, so that's something you should keep in mind. So students who are still in their MSc or starting their PhD, just think about it, what you want to do. And depending on what you want to do, you need to probably make sure all branches of your physics is kind of well covered. Okay. Sorry. Then comes physics of star formation. This physics of star formation is so complicated, so I will not talk about it in much more detail here. Okay, so this star formation itself can be a course. Okay, and it involves fragmentation, formation of molecular clouds, and so on. What you can do is in reionization, what is done is these things. I mean, although we have to understand these, but what people do is people will say that the star formation rate of galaxy means the amount of stars formed per unit time. I can kind of model it by saying that amount of stars formed per unit time must be proportional to the amount of mass available. So more massive the halo, the more stars it will form. Mass available is what? It is the total mass of the halo scaled by omega b by omega m, because that is the gas mass or the baryon mass. But not all baryons will go into stars. Okay, not all baryons can cool. A lot of them will remain in what we call the interstellar medium. So you multiply by a F star, saying that only few percent of the total matter will go into stars. And then the star formation is also time dependent. So the galaxy forms today. The star formation rate may be different in 1 million years, in 10 million years, in 100 million years. So there is a time dependent part which you call, model using a term which I wrote as lambda star. Okay, it's a function of the age of the galaxy, t minus t form. Okay, t form is when the galaxy formed, and t is the time you are calculating the star formation rate. So this is the temporal profile of star formation. Okay, so this temporal profile can have different forms depending on what kind of star is forming. For example, if the star formation rate is constant, then this temporal profile will be a constant. Okay, if it is a star burst, okay, sometimes what happens is a galaxy forms and there's a burst of star formation and then it stops. In that case, lambda star is a sharply peaked function of time. You can almost, the extreme case will be delta function. Okay? Otherwise, you can model it using a sharply rising function going to a peak and then sharply falling function. And there are models which are which are between these two extremes. So it will depend on the star formation model. Now, after star formation comes radiation from stars, and those are done using what are known as population synthesis models. So that will depend on how many stars you have formed, what kind of stars have you formed. I mean, are they all solar mass stars like our sun? But no, I mean, there will be a regime. I mean, there will be small mass stars like solar mass like stars, very heavy stars, and so on. Okay. So that is known as the mass function or the initial mass function of stars. You have to know the metallicity, okay, how much metals are there, and so on. But you can, given these numbers, you can calculate the star formation rate. In fact, there are publicly available codes which will do it for you. So what has been shown, for example, here is the luminosity from a galaxy versus the wavelength. Okay, so that is the spectra. And this is shown for two different kind of metallicities. So the blue one is the metal poor galaxy. The normal is the galaxy like ours, which have metals. Metals means elements higher than helium. Okay, so everything higher than helium in as for astrophysics are metals. So carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, silicon, everything. Okay. So what we understand is the first galaxies won't have metals because metals are not produced in Big Bang nucleosynthesis. Metals are produced actually inside stars. So the first galaxies won't have metals. The next generation of galaxies will have metals because the first generation of stars have produced metals, and then if there is a supernova explosion, they have polluted the universe with metals. Okay. And all metals you see, everything we are made up of have come from stars basically and supernova explosions. And then the right hand plot shows similar curve, but now for different ages. Okay, so this is like 10 to the 6 years, this is like 10 to the 7 years, this is 10 to the 8 years, and you see the spectrum actually changes as a function of time and so on. So all these things can be implemented in the reionization model. But we should also understand that for reionization, if you are trying to understand the full galaxy formation, well and good, you need to understand everything about the stars, their spectra and so on. If you want to concentrate on reionization, it is the main thing you would like to know is the amount of ionizing radiation you are producing. So you would like to know the spectra at energies larger than the hydrogen ionizing energy. Okay, 1 Rydberg or 13.6 electron volts, or whichever unit you have learned. Okay, so you can calculate that. What you have to do is you have to take that spectrum and then you have to integrate it from hydrogen ionizing energy to infinity. Okay, so don't worry about the equations. You can later try to work out the equations yourself. But I'm giving you the basic idea. So this is basically that star formation. This is the spectrum, which has come from a code like starburst. I have just described in the previous slide. And then you just integrate over the frequency corresponding to hydrogen ionization. Okay. Now again, this integral can be approximated because what happens is the ionizing photons are preferentially produced by massive stars, and massive stars die very quickly. Okay, this is the nature of stars. So more massive the star is, the less is the age. Okay, they just die very quickly. So what happens is you can approximate some of these quantities by delta functions. Okay, so and that makes the calculation much simpler. And at the end, you get a quantity which looks like this. This is the number of hydrogen ionizing photons produced by a halo of mass m, which has formed at some time t form, and we are calculating the number of photons at some time t. Okay, this will be the expression which you have. Now, this is for one halo. What you have to do is you have to if you want to do the reionization in the whole universe, then you have to integrate over all halos. To integrate over all halos, you have to know the number of halos produced. How will you know the number of halos produced? You have to refer to my previous lecture. Okay, there we talked about halo mass functions. Number of halos produced of a given mass per unit mass per unit volume. One can calculate either using simple calculations like the Gaussian random field, the spherical collapse or ellipsoidal collapse and things like that, or you can go to the simulations. But in principle, that quantity is calculatable. We calculable. Okay, we have calculated that. There are extra complications which come because you form a halo. That doesn't mean that halo will live forever. What will happen is small halos will merge and form larger halos. Okay, so you have to account for that. So what you have to do is you have to calculate the halo formation rate. Then you have to find out how much time will they survive, their survival probability, and then do the integral. Okay, so this is an extra complication which comes. Now, much of these things can be again simplified. Again, you have to go through the calculations here. I'm not going to take you like through the steps exactly, but you should get a feel for what's going on from here. Okay, but at the end you get a quantity which is the photon production rate. Now that it seems is proportional to F star, the amount of matter which has gone into stars, a quantity called eta gamma. Eta gamma I had defined in the earlier part. Eta gamma is the number of photons produced. So you see it is the spectra of the stars and you integrate over the ionizing frequencies. Okay. Now there is a final piece which is still missing. That is the escape of photons. Okay, you have to figure out how much photons will escape from the galaxy, because if none of the photons escape, then there is no reionization, and so you have to make sure that some fraction do escape. And this quantity is not very well understood. Okay, I mean, forget the quantity. We also, even now we have not much clear about idea about the physics involved in this escape fraction. What are the physical processes which aid these photons to escape? Okay, is it happening because of some turbulence inside the medium? Is it happening because there is supernova blasts and that is taking away matter and hence the photons out? Or is it happening because there are tunnels, like there are regions of low densities like tunnels and the photons can escape from there? So there is a bit of churning going on within the community. This is like active area of research and people are trying to still figure out. Okay. For reionization, we treat it as a parameter in the model. Okay. So we multiply the result by a fraction F escape. We don't know what it is, and we will say that we will try to like fix it from observations. Okay. So at the end, the number of ionizing photons produced is something which looks like this. This is the mass of the halo. This is the number of halos you have, but their formation rate. So you have to take a time derivative. Then you multiply by all these fudge factors. The spectrum, the amount of stars formed, the amount of photons escaping, and then you integrate over all masses which are producing these stars. We have already seen that small mass halos cannot produce stars because the gas cannot cool. So there will be a minimum threshold, which we call M min. Okay, so keep this in mind. This will become important in the tutorials. There is a M min, and the large mass halos can contribute. So integrate up to infinity. Small mass halos cannot contribute. Now there are many things which we don't know: escape fraction, amount of matter which goes into stars, the spectra. But all these three quantities come as multiplicative factors. So what I can do is I can rather define, I can multiply these three and define one unknown parameter, which we call zeta. So it is basically these three parameters, but we want to make the zeta dimensionless, so I multiply by the proton mass. That's the only thing. And then the expression for photon production rate takes actually a much simpler form. So there is a zeta sitting here, there is a M min sitting here. We know this quantity from simulations or our analytical calculations, and then we can integrate and find out the number of photons produced. Number of photons produced will tell you how many hydrogen atoms got ionized. And if you can calculate these numbers as a function of time, you can work out the reionization history of the universe. Okay. This is the only unknown parameter, but this unknown parameter hides a lot of physics. Okay. As I said, the spectra, the amount of stars formed, and the amount of photons which are escaping. If you want to calculate typical values for this quantity, for typical IMF like galaxies, you will see that the value will turn out to be of the order of 10 to 20, 15 to 20 or so. Okay, given typical values of these quantities. Okay, we don't know it very accurately because some of these quantities are not known very accurately. We are only giving you order of magnitude estimation, because as of now, if I don't give the order of magnitude estimation, you don't even know whether it is 10 to the minus 5 or 10 to the 5 or it's what of the order of infinity. But now if we put in some typical numbers, we know that it's at least of the order of 10. Okay, it can be 100 also, because some of these numbers are very approximate, but it's of that order. In fact, we think that if we go to very early stars where there were no metals in the universe, you may actually end up getting a zeta which is more like 100. Okay, whereas usual stars like ours, usual galaxies like ours will give you a number which is more like 20. So keep these numbers in mind. Now what you can do is you can again make these calculations a bit simple. If zeta is independent of the halo mass, let us say, it can come out of this integral. And this integral, if you again remember a bit of my previous class, this quantity is nothing but the collapsed fraction, the amount of mass that is inside the collapsed halos. Okay, so this is that collapsed fraction which we talked about, and this is zeta. So this is what you end up with, and this collapsed fraction will depend on the smallest mass which can form stars. And then what happens is, you can write the number of photons produced as a time derivative of the collapse fraction. Physically, this is very easy to understand. Time evolution of collapse fraction means as more and more halos, collapse fraction increasing means more and more halos are getting formed. More and more halos are getting formed means more and more galaxies are getting formed, and hence more and more number of photons, ionizing photons, are being produced. But this collapse fraction is multiplied by an efficiency parameter which contains all these physics, the galaxy formation physics, the escape of photon physics, and so on. Okay. Yeah, go ahead if there is a question.
Sir, why for the population 3 stars, the MP is of the order of 10 to the power 5?
Not MP, eta gamma MP.
Okay.
So MP is MP, proton mass. It's the eta gamma which is high. Eta gamma is high because these, okay. So since you asked, let me go back to an earlier plot. So look at this. Early stars are metal core. So now I didn't spend much time on this. Look at this rest frame wavelength. what you will see is these metal pole stars are very, okay, this dashed line corresponds to the wavelength, which is the hydrogen ionizing photons, okay? So all wavelengths lower than this will produce hydrogen ionizing photons, because lower wavelengths means higher frequencies. Now, if you concentrate on this left part of this dashed line, you will see metal pole stars produce much higher number of photons than normal stars, okay? Orders of magnitude higher. So this is the reason why that quantity is higher. Physically, what happens is, since there are no metals, the cooling doesn't happen efficiently. So you tend to produce stars which are massive and hotter stars produced more number of ionizing photons. Now, to understand that, just think of a crude model where stars are black body. Okay, actually they are not, but think of stars are black body. So if you want to produce high energy photons, you know from your black body radiation that you need to produce a black body radiation which has higher temperature. So hotter stars will preferentially produce more ionizing photons. Okay, and earlier stars are hotter because they don't cool efficiently because there are no metals. So all these physics combined gives us a value which is, let's go back, gives a value where eta gamma is much higher than, like, order of magnitude higher than what you get in usual stars. However, since the cooling is bad, cooling is poor, the star formation is very efficient. So you see, I would have taken a F star, which is smaller. Okay, but escape is very efficient in those things because there are so many ionizing photons, they can come out very easily. Okay, so these are the main differences between normal stars and early stars. Okay, there is one process which is often ignored but important, that's called feedback. Feedback is the star formation in galaxies can be quenched because of the star formation itself. Okay, so there are many kinds of feedback. So let's give one example, which is a radiative feedback. So what happens is you are forming stars, right? You form stars. Now you ionize the medium. Ionization means you are sending an energetic photon which is ionizing the atom. The electron is coming out from the atom, and whatever excess energy it has, the electron is carrying that energy. So suppose you hit the atom with something like 20 electron volt. What will happen is 13.6 electron volt will go in ionization, and the electron will come out with the rest of the energy. Okay, whatever 6.4 electron volts or so. And then more and more electrons come out. So the energy effectively increases, and that heats up the gas. So ionization will be accompanied by heating of the gas. Now, if you heat up the gas, what happens is in small mass halos, if you start heating up the gas, it will be very difficult to keep the gas within halos. The gas will just blow out. Why? Because if the gas has too much kinetic energy, the gravitational attraction is not enough to hold it. Okay, or that will make it very difficult for the gas to collapse and so on. Okay, so that is a major problem. So what happens is the moment you form stars and ionize the universe, the gas heats up and it starts affecting the star formation, starts quenching the star formation. So this is feedback. Okay, so you do something and that is like harming the future prospects of doing that. So if you now make a model where you say that, oh, I will make reionization very efficient, I will make the galaxies very efficient by doing something. Okay, you make the galaxies efficient, what will happen is you try to do reionization very efficiently, but you will also heat up very quickly, and that will quench the galaxy formation. So there is a regulation which happens. Okay, you just cannot do everything arbitrarily. If you try to do something very efficiently, something will start getting regulated. So the nature somehow can balance itself very well. Okay, so there is there is some, like, there are restrictions. You just cannot do whatever you want inside the models. This was radiative. Similar thing can happen because of mechanical feedback. Like if there is a supernova explosion, what will happen is it will, like, the supernovas come out with so much energy that the gases can be just expelled from small mass halos. And then there is chemical feedback. Chemical feedback is what I just told, that first generation of stars were like metal free or metal poor, but these stars produce metal and the gas gets polluted with metal. So the next generation of stars have different properties. Okay, so that's called chemical feedback. So the formation of stars are affecting the next generation of stars in some way. Okay, sometimes feedback can be negative, sometimes feedback can be positive. Negative feedback will lead to regulation. And the final piece which we would like to understand is the growth of ionized regions. So what happens is, suppose all these things have happened, galaxies have formed. So imagine these things are galaxies, a simple thing, and they have ionized a region around them. So the universe will be kind of two-phase. There is an ionized part and there is a neutral part, which is white. Now, if you want to understand this part, this physics, a simple way to understand is that imagine the galaxies have produced some photons with some rate, and it has produced a ionized mass. So a fraction QH2 is ionized. Okay, I would use this notations H1 and H2 all the time. H1 means neutral hydrogen, H2 means ionized hydrogen. This is a spectroscopic notation. Okay, and this is widely used in astrophysics. Now, in time interval delta t, what will happen is I will produce this many number of photons per unit volume. Why? Because n dot is the photon production rate, and then I multiply by delta t. That will give me the total photon production in some infinitesimal interval delta t. Now, these photons will be consumed in two ways. Some of the photons will be consumed in ionizing previously neutral regions. So you see, previously ionized regions were this brownish part, rest was white, but now what has happened is these new photons have ionized a bit more. So the ionized regions have grown from this brownish part to this purplish part. Okay, and this extra part is done in the time interval delta t. So as a result, QH2 increases by an amount delta QH2. But that is not all. Some of the photons are actually consumed inside the previously ionized regions, because what happens is, even if you ionize an atom, there is a non-zero probability that the proton and electron will come together and recombine and form an atom again. So if you want to keep the region ionized, you have to keep on ionizing the hydrogen again and again and again. Okay, and it will depend on how efficient these recombinations are. So this is the photons. Some of the photons will go in ionizing the residual hydrogen in already ionized region. So this is the recombination. And what you can do is, you can just convert this, divide both sides by delta t and take the limit delta t going to 0. What you will end up is with a differential equation, which will give you dq dt, that's the growth of ionized regions, is driven by photons, n dot. Higher the n dot, the quicker is reionization, minus the recombinations. Okay, you will lose some photons because of recombination. So that will stop the growth. Okay, so there is this competition happening, and that will give you dq dt. Q will be 0 initially, everything is neutral, and then Q will increase because galaxies will form n dot, and eventually will hit 1. So if you can solve this equation, we will know about reionization history. Okay, and then if you know reionization history, you can use that to calculate other quantities like tau. Okay, and compare it with CMB observations and so on. But this Q is not an arbitrary thing. It's a very, there is a lot of physics in this term which is hidden. Okay, and that's why I spend so much time in this talk telling about these things. So this brings to the end of the discussion today. So whatever time is remaining, I will take questions now. But I have given you a flavor of what is reionization and what are the physical processes involved. And of course, all these things you have. I mean, if you want to understand, you have to like work out the equations and understand what is going on. But my idea was to give only an overview rather than going into the complicated equations. Okay. So the summary, the take-home messages is that epoch of reionization is like very important, is the final frontier of observational cosmology. The reionization physics is very complicated, is very nonlinear. Broadly, there are three components. One is this cosmic density field, the perturbations, the dark matter halos, the large scale density fields, and so on. The sources, the galaxy and the stars, and the ionization fronts, okay, which are kind of the radiative transfer that's happening in the medium. Okay. It's easy to it's possible to understand the basic physical picture through analytical modeling, and that's something which the flavor I gave. But if you want to do cutting edge research, you have to go to numerical kind of calculations, because analytical calculations will take you up to some extent. Your understanding will develop. But if you want to really calculate observables and compare with observations, there is no option but to go to numerical calculations and preferably simulations. Okay, so I will stop here. If there are any further questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or chat box is also fine, whichever is easier for you.
Why reionization is important for cosmic evolution?
Reionization is important for cosmic evolution. I don't understand. I understand the question. It's like asking why are the galaxies important for cosmic evolution, or something like that. I mean, cosmic evolution, reionization is part of cosmic evolution. It's one phase in our universe.
Without reionization, galaxy formation may not be possible.
No, reionization is a byproduct of galaxy formation. So reionization, galaxy formation is the cause, reionization is the effect. But once you reionize, it affects the next generation of galaxies. So it's a coupled problem. First, galaxies are the cause, reionization is the effect, then reionization becomes cause of galaxies of the next generation. A cause in the sense it affects the formation of the next generation of galaxies. So it's not like if reionization did not happen, that would not happen. That's not the correct way of looking at it. Reionization must happen in our universe. There is no other way. Okay. The question is, what can you do with that?
Okay, thank
So you can understand galaxy formation, you can even understand cosmological parameters and so on. Yeah.
Sir, I had a question.
Yes.
How does the E modes of CMB gets affected by the reionization, and why does they only affect the small L modes? Can you please explain that a little bit more?
Okay. So let me see. Yes, we are talking about this slide. Why? What about the polarization? So first of all, as you know, Thomson scattering, I mean, the scattering which is happening has angular dependence, and that can give rise to polarization of the CMB. So the same Thomson scattering happens in the when the CMB is getting formed before the recombination epoch. The same Thomson scattering is happening during reionization. Okay. Now polarization is produced in the last scattering surface during when the CMB is being produced. Polarization is also produced during reionization. Okay, it's all happening because of the non-trivial angular dependence of the Thomson scattering cross section. Now it turns out that if you work out the equations, the polarization signal will peak at scales corresponding to the horizon size at which the scattering is happening. Okay, so it's the horizon which is playing a role here, okay, in this. Now the horizon size is much smaller during the last scattering surface, and it increases. During reionization, the horizon size is much larger. So clearly, the polarization signal which arises in the last scattering surface will be peaking at much smaller scales compared to the polarization signal which is arising at the reionization epoch. Because in the reionization epoch, as I have said, the horizon size is very large. So this then translates into the reionization signal being prominent at low L values. Remember, low L values are large angular scales, basically large scales. So that is why the reionization signal peaks at low L, and there is no physics in the last scattering surface which can give rise to such a prominent polarization signal at low L, okay, because that those L values corresponding to scales which are much larger than the horizon size during the last scattering surface. Okay? So that is why we know that that signal, once it is observed, it has to come from reionization. There is no other physics which can give rise to it. Okay? So, and that is why it's happening at low L. By the way, reionization can also give rise to not only E modes but also B modes and so on. Okay. But that's a different story altogether, and the signal is much weaker, difficult to detect, but it has many other implications, and we have done a lot of work on that, but let me not go into it. It will open a completely different line of like discussions. But yes, this is the summary.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
So somebody has asked, Tausif has asked, how are dark matter halos different from other halos? I don't know what you mean by other halos. There is dark matter halos, only dark matter halos. That's it. Okay. I mean, as far as cosmology is concerned. There's something else on the chat box. Aritra Kundu, he has asked, what are the changes one needs to incorporate when using quasars for modeling reionization? And if quasars are also responsible for reionization, what observational changes can we see? So the changes you need to do is, okay, so suppose I go to this part. So the changes you need to do are, quasars will also form in dark matter halos inside galaxies. So galaxy and star formation physics you have to understand, but on top of that, you have to understand how the supermassive black holes form. How they form, how they merge, how they grow, and so on. Once you have an understanding of that, you can model quasars and radiation from quasars. Okay. To the 0th order, you can, if I can go to a later slide, for example, a slide like this, you can, at the end, even the quasar model can also be reduced to an equation like this, except the zeta parameter, its interpretation will be very different. Currently, the zeta parameter has galaxy properties. Their zeta parameter will have quasar properties, these supermassive black holes, how they form and so on. So that is the challenges, that's the modeling aspect. What happens is quasar, the supermassive black holes, tend to form in preferentially large mass halos, large galaxies, and hence large mass halos. So typically, the quasars will form in halos which are much larger than the star forming halos. Okay, so quasars, the number of quasars formed will be much less than the number of stars, but then each quasars will be very efficient producers of ionizing photons. So you may be able to make up for that. But we think that quasar cannot be drivers of reionization. First, because observationally we know that by redshift 6, you cannot form enough quasars. It's impossible. It's very difficult to form black holes. First of all, it's very difficult to form these supermassive black holes, and then them to grow efficiently by redshift 6. There is just not enough time available. Okay, so you will form quasars, but very few of them, not enough to ionize the universe. So at best, they can contribute to a fraction of the reionization, but they cannot be the dominant drivers of reionization. Observationally, the quasar reionization via quasar will have a big effect on something I did not discuss, which is helium reionization. Okay. Now, helium reionization is a much more complicated stuff because helium has 2 electrons. And it turns out that helium reionization requires photons of much larger energies. Okay, you need photons which are 4 times the energy of 13.6 electrons volt, what you need for hydrogen. So, and that cannot happen with stars. So you need quasars to do helium reionization. Now, if you want to do hydrogen reionization with quasars, what will happen is helium will also get reionized with hydrogen. If you do hydrogen reionization with stars, then what you can do is you have to wait till the quasars come up for helium reionization. So currently we have observational evidence where hydrogen reionization happened at redshift 6, helium reionization happened at redshift 3. Okay. If you try to do hydrogen reionization by quasars, what will happen is helium reionization will also happen at redshift 6, and that will violate the observational constraints. So that's where the situation is. Okay, Anubhav Banerjee asks, the superluminal jets from AGNs have any contribution towards reionization? So jets are jets. Okay, so what we need is ionizing photons. So what will happen is the quasars will also have jets, but as we said that AGNs have very little contribution toward the ionization. So AGNs themselves have very little contribution towards the ionization. So a quick answer is unlikely. Then Rumela Kaur has asked, does reionization depend only on IgM or depend on ISM too? So I don't understand the question. Since it depends on star formation, also does ISM and IgM overlap? So ISM is the diffuse medium inside galaxies. Intergalactic medium is the diffuse medium outside galaxies. And their boundary is basically, there is a gray area. So of course, where does the galaxy end and where does the intergalactic medium start? But beyond that, there is no confusion. ISM is much more dense, IgM is much more diffuse, and so on. And there could be a transition region between the two. It cannot be like ISM ends here and the IgM starts immediately afterwards. There is a transition region. So that's what it is. Reionization, of course, ionization photons will be produced in stars. So first they have to overcome the ISM. So that is accounted for in the escape fraction. So if everything is consumed within the ISM, then the escape fraction will be extremely low. But the bulk of the cosmic matter resides in IgM. More than 90%, and at higher redshift, it is 99% of cosmic matter is in the IgM, not inside galaxies, not in ISM. Okay, so it's the reionization of IgM which we are trying to study. Okay. Any other question? Then unmute yourself or put in the chat box.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
That the quasar absorption spectra for redshift Z equal to 3, we observe the absorption like feature. But what about the quasar absorption spectra for Z equal to 6.28? Are there absorption spectra at that redshift or?
So this is the absorption spectra. What is happening is, imagine, so here what you are seeing is, you can see the quasar continuum almost, but on top of that, there is many narrow absorption lines. That is the feature.
Line.
Here what has happened is the absorption has become so strong that the whole thing, this thing has gone to 0. So this is a very strong absorption here. The intermediate case is here, 5.8. You can see something like this Lyman alpha forest, but you see it is slightly deeper, in the sense more absorption has happened. So there is less transmission, less luminosity or less light which is coming to us. Okay, here there is almost no light which is coming to us. So everything has gotten absorbed. Okay, so this is the part you should concentrate on. So this is the part corresponding to this part here. And you see the difference. So this is, all of them are absorption spectra. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so any other questions or comments?
So I just wanted to make an announcement before we end that from 2:30 we will have a hands-on session, and I have already sent you the material on the Slack channel. I hope everybody, all of you have downloaded that notebook, and all of you have gone through the instructions, the preliminary instructions. So make sure you have that Google Colab open by 2:30. Okay. And then if there are difficulties, I will try to solve there, but I'm sure all of you can open the Colab and open the notebook there. Okay. And then we will go through that notebook systematically and see what's there. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, Supratik. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, yeah. So if there is no more question, let's thank Tit once again for a very comprehensive discussion on reionization.